Hi guys, I am going to make cinnamon rolls this week. So the first step on cinnamon rolls is to measure out 1 cup of milk. So I'm going to look at it sideways, make sure it's 1 cup. And then the milk needs to be lukewarm to put the yeast in, so I'm going to warm it up a little bit. Alright, now the recipe says the milk needs to be lukewarm, and lukewarm is between 98 degrees and 105 degrees. So let me go ahead and test it and see. And I got it a little too hot, but yeah, quite a bit too hot. But I'm going to go ahead and go with it, and hopefully it won't kill my yeast. If it does, I'll start over. So we need 2 1/4 cups of yeast. 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. So there's my 2 teaspoons and the 1/4 teaspoon. And the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of sugar. I'm going to go ahead and measure the sugar out, and I'm going to take 1 teaspoon of that sugar and put it in the yeast. That way it can start to activate the yeast. And I'm going to let that set for about 5 minutes until it foams up. So the yeast is foamed up in the milk. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the next step. So we're going to add the sugar, butter, salt, and eggs. And it's 1/2 cup of sugar minus the 1 teaspoon we put in the yeast. The butter is 1/3 cup, and you can measure 1/3 cup, but you'll notice, depending on which kind, you can see where it shows you to cut it. You can also weigh it like what we would do in school. I'm going to go ahead and cut where it shows me to cut, and then I'm going to weigh it to make sure it's the right amount. And to weigh it, it should be 2.7 ounces, and that's 2.6 ounces, so that's pretty good. I'm going to throw that in. And it's a teaspoon of salt. We're going to measure our teaspoon of salt and throw it in. And this time I'm using the stand mixer with dough hooks. When you make a yeast dough, you have to use dough hooks on your stand mixer. You cannot use regular beaters. These are for cake batters or a quick bread, mashed potatoes, something like that. They don't work for a yeast bread. So, oops. Go ahead and start with the sugar and the butter and the salt. And add in my 2 eggs. And I'm going to start adding the flour, and this recipe calls for 4 cups of flour. So we'll go one at a time, just like with regular bread. Any yeast dough that you make is pretty much the same. Weather plays an important role in what you're doing, and your measurement is pretty important. So you're going to want to make sure that everything works out right. Measuring just 1 cup of dough at or 1 cup of flour at a time. And getting it all mixed in. You can do this by hand. As well. And the more of your ingredients you get put in your bowl, the more it's going to start working for you. So I've got 3 cups of flour in now. I'm going to let it work for a while. And then I'm going to pour in my milk and my yeast mixture. Depending on the size of bowl on your mixer, depends on if you can scrape down the sides while it's mixing or not. My bowl is pretty wide, so I have plenty of room. I can scrape down the sides of my bowl. If your bowl is more narrow and tall, that will not work. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put my 4th cup of flour in. Starting to come together pretty good. It's starting to get all the flour mixed in. Getting pretty stiff. Alright, everything's pretty well mixed in, and it's looking pretty nice and soft. I'm going to turn it out on my counter just to make sure it's looking like it's supposed to. Looks like I'm going to add some more flour to it too. It's still a little wet. So even though the recipe called for 4 cups, I'm going to add a little more to it, and I'm going to work it some by hand. As you can see, it's pretty sticky still. And I'm going to knead it a little bit here. Do a little more of the mixing with it. Now this dough will be, it's very similar to the regular bread that I made before. This one just has milk and eggs in it, which is going to make a more tender dough, and it has more flour in it, it has more sugar in it, which is going to make it a sweeter dough. That's why this dough is good for cinnamon rolls. You can use this dough just to make bread, regular bread as well, but it'll just be a little bit sweeter. And if you don't have a stand mixer at home with dough hooks, you can mix it all by hand like I did with the other bread dough. All right, so that dough is nice and smooth now. Go ahead and spray my bowl. Make sure my dough ball gets all oiled up. And I'm going to cover it with plastic wrap again, and I'm going to let it set on the stove and let it raise for about an hour, hour and a half until it's about double in size. We're going to go ahead and make the filling for the cinnamon rolls since the dough has risen. So we need a third of a cup of butter again, which is 2.7 ounces. So I'm going to use these small little pieces I have left over and weigh them. 2.3. Add a little at a time, hopefully, until I get the right amount. And that's close. I'll go with that. Dump it in the bowl. And we need a cup of packed brown sugar. And remember, always when you measure your brown sugar, it has to be packed. But then you have to push it down in there and get it all packed in nice and tight. And then dump it in. And if you've packed it tight enough, if you remember, it will retain its shape. Tablespoons of cinnamon. And since this is the filling, you want to stick close to your measurements, but if you're a little bit off, whoops, on the filling, that'll be okay. Maybe not quite that far off, but that'll be all right. The hazard of measuring your spices over your recipe is that you get too much sometimes. And then you mix all that together. Now, when you make the filling for your rolls, you can do it a couple of different ways. I like to mix my butter and cinnamon and sugar all together before I put it on. Some people like to spread the butter on the dough and then put the cinnamon and sugar on after that. So however you want to do it is fine. I've seen even some people melt the butter and spread the melted butter on the dough, which makes a really big mess, but you can do it however you want to do it. So get that all mixed in to where it's, you can't see the chunks of butter. Dough is ready to roll out. So we're going to sprinkle a little bit of flour. dough. Just a little bit. And you want to roll it. It needs to be a rectangle. So it says about 16 inches long, so if you have a ruler you can measure it. That's pretty close to 16 inches long and about 12 inches wide, so I'm going to roll it out a little bit wider. And about 1/4 of an inch tall, I guess you would say. You want it as close to a rectangle as you can get it. So that's pretty close. We'll go with that. And then you spread your filling on. You do want to, as you work on your filling, get it close to your edges so you don't have a lot of part of your roll that doesn't have filling in it. But you don't want to go too far over the edges. And on that far edge there, I don't want to get it too close because that's where I'm going to seal the rolls after I roll it up. So I don't want to get it too close to the edges on that one side. Just kind of spread it out evenly. And of course, as it bakes, the butter will melt and everything will just kind of get all nice and gooey in there. Alright, so then you start on the end, on this long edge close to you, and you roll it. Keeping all of your filling inside. Decently tight and as even as you can. Then when I get to the end, I'm going to pinch the dough together. This is why I didn't want to get too much filling too close to this last edge. If I had too much butter in there, my ends won't pinch. So I'm going to pinch that together. Then I'm going to cut my rolls. You can use a knife. A knife will smash your rolls a little bit. You can use thread or you can use floss, dental floss. And I'll show you how to do that. I use thread because that's how my grandma taught me to do it. But dental floss works as well. So you want to go about 1 inch to 1.5 inches on width of your rolls. So you slide your thread or your floss underneath and you pull it up, pull together, and it cuts like that. And you can just set those out of the way while you finish up. And if you use thread or floss, then your rolls tend to be a little more even as well. Instead of flattened. If you flatten them with a knife, you can reshape them. And you want to get them as close to the same size as possible, because again, just like everything we cook, if it's the same size, it's going to cook more evenly. Got all of our rolls cut, so I'm going to go ahead and put them on my sheet. Those are some pretty big ones. Just a little space in between them, so when they rise a little bit more, they will touch. And I used parchment paper again on my sheet. You can spray it or use butter, however you want to do it. Just spread them out on your pan. And this little tiny one is one of the ends, and that, I don't know where the other end is. They usually end up being the small ones, and sometimes they're a little deformed, but they still taste good. So once you've got them on there, then you go ahead and cover them again, and you're going to let them sit and raise on the warm stove for about 30 minutes. So I'm going to cover them just so they don't dry out. And I'm going to set them back on the stove where they're against some warm heat, and they're going to rise. Have risen, and we're going to go ahead and put them in the oven for about 20 minutes. Start the timer. And while they're in the oven, we are going to make the frosting. So this particular frosting is a cream cheese frosting, and it starts with some butter, 6 tablespoons of butter. Which, if we go ahead and weigh it out, is 3 ounces. Ooh, right on. And the cream cheese is a 1/4 cup of cream cheese, but I'm going to go ahead and weigh it out, and that will be 2 ounces of cream cheese. Okay. It's a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. And it calls for 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. So we don't usually have 1/8 of a teaspoon. I have a 1/4. So what I'm going to do is just go about 1/2 of that and pour it in. It's usually about a pinch or so. It's not a whole lot. The little bit of salt just does, the job of that little bit of salt is to cut the sweetness of the sugar. So that's the reason we put it in there. And then it's 1½ cups of powdered sugar. So we're going to start with the 1 cup. Clean that mess up. And I'm going to use the hand mixer on this. And you want to start low, on low speed, so you don't fling your powdered sugar all over. Go ahead and put the rest of my powdered sugar in, which will be another 1/2 of a cup. So then we're just gonna let that set then until the rolls are done and we ice the rolls. All right, so the rolls are done. I'm gonna go ahead and take them out. There they are browned. I'm gonna let them sit here and cool for a few minutes before we ice them. So the rolls have cooled for about 30 minutes, so we're gonna go ahead and frost them. And that's pretty easy. You just put your frosting on and spread it around. Some on each roll. And they're still warm, so the frosting's gonna melt some. That'll help you spread it out a little bit. And you just want to put some on every roll. All right, that's pretty much it.